Well, hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you are doing really good today. Answering some requests that have been asking me to do some more philosophical stuff, I decided that this could be a good opportunity to do so. I've been inspired to think a bit further about the question of expressing an I in thought, and was attracted to the idea of drawing a comparison between Carl Jung and Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher. You'll see that this will have an impact, what comes out of this analysis will have an impact on how we lead our lives and how we relate to others and to our sense of ourselves in the world. So hopefully the practical dimension will be important. But I thought, that having written the manuscript for the new book, my mind has got a bit clearer on certain aspects of that relationship. And you'll see that, in my opinion, Plato and Jung express two fundamental ways of conveying, an I insight, if you like, and that has actually important consequences on the way we lead our lives, depending on which way we embrace. Okay, so before I embark on this analysis, let me just remind you that I've written a book on the INFJ type, the Ecstatic Soul. It's a bestseller. Check it out. If you haven't got a copy, the links are below. If you want to have the deepest understanding of the INFJ type, this is just a book to get. You also have The Infinite Castle, which is a novel. You can support my channel. It's a very nice book and supports me, but also rumor has it the main character is an INFJ. Otherwise, it's good old psychological fiction with some magical realism in it. If you like Murakami and Kafka and people like that, you might just love it. And don't forget, you can also support me on Patreon. The link is first down there. Helps massively. You can even support a very small amount. The idea that the more people do that, the more it helps me continue doing the readings and the various things to continue running this channel. Okay, so now, NI in Plato versus NI in Jung. So perhaps we can start with just a basic premise, right? The basic premise is that Jung tends to be seen by the community as an INFJ type. Jung is also typed by those who use visual cues from his interviews as an IFE type, so overlapping with INFJ in our language. And that Plato tends to be seen as an INFJ as well. So at least we can start from this baseline, that whether it be Jung or Plato, we are dealing most likely with two INFJs. It's important for our comparison because we want to really say that we're going to be comparing two NI dominants and the two approaches that they have to expressing the fundamental, dimension of introverted intuition. So basically, just to start in a concrete sense, the fundamental expression of NI in Jung is articulated through his concept of archetypes. The fundamental expression of NI in Plato is expressed through his conception of ideas, with a capital I, sometimes also referred to as forms, with a capital F. Now, at a surface level, we might be tempted to say these two conceptions are very similar, and they do indeed sound a lot like introverted intuition, and quite possibly combined when it comes to articulating the insights with extroverted feeling and its own universalizing tendencies, social universalizing tendencies. Now, why are Platonic ideas or forms on the one hand and Jungian archetypes expressive of introverted intuition? Well, because both of them have to do, certainly at what very, very basic level, with the presence of the eternal in our lives. That is to say, we lead ordinary lives constituted by events day to day that are perfectly temporal and move from one to the next, and we have our routines, and we have events that are not routine, but we are steeped in the temporal now, and we proceed, as it were, from one event to the next. So there's a certain sense in which we are just these finite beings that are living in a temporal world, right? And 99% constituted by just like the ordinary happening of things across our day-to-day. The NI insight, of course, has to do with a certain sense of what you may be tempted to call atemporality, but is more something that I would call eternality. You know, that there is something underneath human experience that actually has a claim to a claim to a way vaster stretch of time that essentially knows no bounds and is meaningful for us in that it captures something that, you know, is irrespective of one particular moment that across our ordinary existence or the next. It has a validity claim to just any moment, past, present, or future. So this is what we call the eternality of introverted intuition. It's something that leads some people to speak of INFJs as future-oriented, leads other people to speak of INFJs as past toward future-oriented with only a momentary location in the now. That's something that often is expressed to distinguish introvert intuition from extrovert intuition, which is much more of the now in its essence. But we have here something essential about the NI expression. It's this expression of eternality, right? Something underneath that we can't immediately see. It's not accessible in the now, but nevertheless undergirds it and has an eternal validity claim. So far, we can say that Plato and Jung agree. But there is a moment where they depart, okay? And what I would argue is that they depart in exactly how they understand and articulate this eternality that is the domain of the NI validity claim. For Plato, the eternal, which is encapsulated in the ideas, is a pure timelessness, okay? That is to say that the ideas are these abstract forms of which anything we do in our life, any object that we come across, are copies, right? They are temporal copies of this perfected form that exists in a transcendent realm of ideas. So in some sense, we can only but be copies of that perfected realm. Now you can easily see here something that is going to be crucial to the articulation of the Christian worldview, particularly in Augustine's the city of God, right? City of man, realm of the imperfect copies, city of God, the realm of the ideas. Augustine is well known to have produced a brand of Platonic influenced Christianity. But for now, let's just focus on this idea that ideas indeed, or forms for Plato, are these perfect abstractions that are always manifest in the copies, but the copies can more or less reproduce them, you know, with various degrees of fidelity, which is why, you know, Plato talks about, you know, love, and we have this conception of Platonic love. The idea being that Platonic love is the one that is most closely aligned with the Platonic form, and then you have various degrees of corruption. And you can apply that to just any object, whether physical object in the world or mental object in the world. They're always copies of the perfect ideas, and they can have a higher or lower level of perfection or corruption. They can never be exactly the idea, but the idea for Plato is that the philosopher ought to lead people of the everyday to lead lives that are as closely aligned to the Platonic forms as possible, to this timeless abstraction of perfection, okay? This is different from Jung, because for Jung, the archetype, although it is eternal in some sense, it is actually not eternal in the same sense that the Platonic eternal is eternal. For Jung, the eternality of the archetype is always relative to the existence of human beings. If there was no human being on planet Earth, we would not be talking about eternal archetypes. So it's not actually quite eternal. It seems eternal to us because it is lodged in our psyches, being the psyches of human beings. But if there were no human beings, you wouldn't have no eternality of this sort. So it is not quite an eternality. And we see it all the more in the fact that it is not an abstraction. Here, the distinction between the Platonic form and the Jungian archetype is most apparent, because the Platonic form is quintessentially a transcendent abstraction, whereas the Jungian archetype is quintessentially an immanent, so not a transcendent, the immanent concretion. The archetype is something that is lodged in our psyches. It's lodged in the unconscious part of our psyches, and it does influence and direct our lives very much in ways that are similar to the way that Platonic forms do, but it is symbolic rather than abstract in terms of, its manifestation. And Jung is always very clear that the symbol is not a sign. It might sound a bit abstruse when expressed like this, but the idea is essentially that a symbol is a concretion, and the reason why it's difficult to read, why NI finds it very difficult to articulate it, and comes across difficult to understand for people when it is at its most unfiltered, is that the symbol is rather than being something that is timeless, is actually an eternal moment of gathered time from time immemorial, when the archetype started to aggregate to itself various life experiences that were then, condensed in the psyche across time to now. So the archetype is better understood as a hyper-condensed point of accumulated experiences of mankind. And in a sense, the archetype is almost like a historical register of all that we have done, experienced, and succeeded at in relation to particular objects, whether they be physical objects, physical events, or mental objects, mental events. So you see here an important difference between the abstract form in Plato, which is not of this world and is eternal in the sense of being timeless outside of time, whereas the Jungian archetype is of this world, it's relative to human existence, and it is in time. But instead of being eternal in the sense, like I said, of timelessness, it's like a hyper-condensation of all the moments that humanity has been through, condensed in the psyche. And it influences us as a kind of compass for what has worked out for us, right? And it is true that Jung holds that it is possible, or that is operative rather, that the archetype influences us in all of our dealings. And we can be more or less aware of the archetypes. Just like Plato thinks that we can be more or less aware of the ideas. But you see here the difference. And the reason why this has practical consequences is that people, especially, everybody potentially, but I think INFJs being the one most likely to be sensitive to these ecosystems, are going to be always, and up to this day, very tempted to take one path or the other. To take expressive NI more in the Platonic sense, or more in a Jungian sense. And so the question becomes, which one is better to take with regard to our well-being, with regard to our sense of purpose and fulfillment in this world, in this existence of ours. Now, I would personally hold that the Jungian archetype approach is the better one, because you see, because of the way that the Platonic forms are articulated, there's a certain ruthlessness to them. If you fail at correctly capturing to the best of your ability as a copy the form, you are corrupted. You can easily see how that leads to the idea of corruption as sin in Augustinian Christianity and later Christianity. There's something very punitive about the idea of an abstraction that as a copy you could never actually ever hope to be like. All that you could ever do is be as much like it as you can, and that's why it's important to be aware of the idea so that they can inspire you to be as much as possible like they are. If you see a parallel between the idea that you're born in sin and you can never be like angels, but you can try to be as much like saints and angels as possible, well, I think that you will be right to notice the comparison is obvious. The lineage is obvious. So there's something punitive about it because it starts from the essential premise of human corruption and the idea that, if you fall short, you have to be brought back into line. And sometimes, and often in our lives, in various ideologies that have been more Platonic in temperament. There have been massacres, murders, there have been totalitarianisms that have been predicated on bringing people into these close categories of you fit or you're rectified. And if you have to be rectified through suffering and torture, we will do that. In the case of the Jungian archetypes, the situation is completely different. Jung does advocate for as much awareness of the existence and agency of the archetypes as possible. But it is not so that you can be as much as possible aligned with the sayings and expression of the archetype. The archetype is of this world, and the archetype is influencing you no matter what you do. There's something deeply human about the archetype, even if the archetype is indicative of something about us, of our humanity, that is unconscious and psychic, and therefore that the more materialist among us would not be considered part of our humanity. But it is Jung's essential hypothesis that it is that humans have this dimension to them that goes beyond the purely material. It nevertheless is still part of our human essence, if you want to use this word. But the more you are aware of the archetype for Jung, in fact, the more you're able to beware of the excessive influence of the archetype. So you see how the difference here is fundamental. For Plato, the more you're aware, the more you try to be like the form, the better your life will be. And if you fail to do that, you will be rectified by hook or by crook. So you see the authoritarian dimension lurking beneath. Whereas for Jung, the more you're aware of the archetype, the more you can lead a life of individuation and fulfillment. Being aware of the archetype, but having freedom from the extreme influence of the archetype. Because the archetype for Jung, since it is in our unconscious psyches, it's always going to be governing what we do. Most of the time it's very helpful because it is a repository of condensed knowledge about all kinds of human situations, emotions, states of affairs, and so on. But at the same time, there is always going to be this temptation to just follow what the archetype says and be fascinated by the archetype, and in fact fall into the Platonic illusion that the archetype is a form and that we should conform to it. So there's always this risk of fascination, which is most likely to happen in the case of introverted intuitives, or in the case of extroverted sensors that are in a situation of grip, or where the inferior function takes over and enters into competition with the dominant, where like the archaic and infantile forms, psyche and behavior come across. Either way, in order to bring something new to the archetype, which is a repository that always needs more food, needs more events, needs more information. It's not this thing in the transcendent universe, it's right here. And it is accumulating new information. But in order to be able to accumulate new information, do its work well, you need to have the freedom to bring it new information rather than just to repeat what it already has and lead a life that is completely under its spell. So it's good for you and for the archetype that you do things that are not completely influenced by the archetype and that you have your freedom from the archetype. That is very, very different from the Platonic conception where there's nothing beyond the idea. The closer you are to it, the better. Another important ethical and political dimension of this idea of freedom from the archetype in Jung is that, well, it's also going to promote, as, in a practical sense, in terms of a world ethical and political worldview, something much more pluralistic and supportive of human freedoms. Because the idea is not punitive here, is that the more free you are, the better. And the more creative you are in using your own agency to bring new information to the archetype, the better for yourself, your life, your happiness, and that of the archetype. So you're working together rather than working against an idea that you can never quite reach in the first place. So I think that, compassionate and open pluralism of conception, of relationship with others, is much more likely to arise out of a Jungian archetypal expression of NI than it is of a Platonic form expression of NI. Let me know what you think, if you agree, if you understood what I meant. Let's interact in the conversation down below, and I'll see you next week, guys. Take care.